They had marched for days. Their boots were worn thin, their uniforms dirty and stiff with sweat. Captured German nurses from the Eastern Front, they expected humiliation, perhaps a cold barrack filled with suspicion. Instead, they were led towards something wholly unfamiliar at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. In the summer of 1943, the gates opened not into a stockade, but into a world so polished, so strangely immaculate, that the women stopped in disbelief. The first thing they noticed was the light. Not the dim glow of oil lamps or flickering candles, but a blaze of brightness radiating from long corridors lined with polished tiles. The air was heavy with a clean, almost metallic scent, antiseptic, so strong it stung their nostrils, a fragrance of science and sterility that belonged to a different age, the sound of boots clicking on marble, the hum of unseen machines, the faint echo of trolley wheels carrying instruments, all combined to create the sense that they had stepped into another century. Nurse Anna Keller, 31 years old, whispered in her Swabian accent, "Das ist kein Lazarett, Distin. This is not a hospital. This is a palace." Her words were noted by one of the guards, who would later recall the mixture of awe and fear that crossed her face in that moment. These were women accustomed to shadowy corners, makeshift tables, morphine rations so thin they had to be hidden from orderlies. Here, medicines stood in neat rows like soldiers at attention, glass bottles glinting under harsh light everywhere they turned. There were wounded men, American, British, even German prisoners of war, resting on crisp white sheets. Their bandages were clean, their faces calm, the air punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of oxygen tanks. One soldier, his arm encased in plaster, raised his head and smiled at the nurses as they passed. It was not a sneer, not a threat, but a smile. The women exchanged glances. Was this some kind of trick? Outside the wide glass windows they could see ambulances arriving, unloading stretchers one after another. Yet there was no chaos. Order reigned. Doctors in spotless coats moved with quiet efficiency, calling for instruments, giving calm instructions, their voices carried by microphones and intercoms. For women who had spent years improvising in chaos, sewing wounds with thread meant for uniforms, boiling water in tin kettles for lack of sterilizers, this was beyond comprehension. The moment was not just shocking, it was destabilizing. For the first time since capture, they felt themselves not as prisoners, but as witnesses. Witnesses to something larger than war, larger than victory or defeat. A question hung in the air they could not yet articulate. If America could build hospitals like this, what else could it do? The corridor gave way to wards, and with each step the shock deepened. The German nurses had prepared themselves for scorn, perhaps being treated as little more than spoils of war, forced to scrub floors or wash linens in silence. Instead, what they saw struck at the very foundation of what they had been taught. At Ward C, an American medic named Corporal James Monroe adjusted the blanket of a wounded man. The nurses leaned closer. The man on the bed was not American. His uniform cap, set aside on the table, bore the eagle within a swastika, a German prisoner. Yet Monroe's hands were steady, careful, even kind. He spoke gently as he cleaned the wound. No insults, no spit, no contempt, just a healer at work. It was here that Sister Hilda Bronn, 35 years old, stiffened. She had buried comrades in Poland who died not from their injuries, but from neglect. German ideology had taught her that enemies were enemies until death, but here she saw something else. An American sergeant offered the wounded German water, raising his head with surprising tenderness. Hilda's lips parted, but no words came. One of the American doctors, Captain Robert Stein, the son of German immigrants who had fled long before Hitler, walked briskly past. His voice carried down the hall as he instructed orderlies. Plasma first, then morphine, get him ready for surgery. He did not differentiate between the flags on their uniforms. To him, every soldier was a patient. Later that evening, when the German nurses were allowed to sit in a small barracks room, Anna Keller scribbled in her confiscated diary, the one she had managed to hide inside the lining of her bag. Today, I witnessed the impossible. The enemy treated us as humans, and even my wounded compatriots as if they were his own. The gossip spread quickly among the women. One whispered that she had seen an American nurse share chewing gum with a prisoner. Another that a doctor had paused to shake a German soldier's hand before surgery. Small acts. almost trivial, but they lodged deep in memory. For these women trained in the brutal pragmatism of German military medicine, where shortages stripped away humanity, such gestures were almost unbearable in their gentleness. The contradiction gnawed at them. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of Americans as brutes, obsessed with money, incapable of real sacrifice. Yet in this place, they saw Americans sacrificing sleep, working tirelessly to heal even those who had tried to kill them. The lesson pressed into their minds with each passing hour. To the Americans, a wounded man was not a category, but a life. If this is our enemy, one nurse muttered under her breath, then what have we become? Her words went unanswered. The room fell silent. Outside, the faint rhythm of typewriters recorded the names of the newly admitted. Each soldier listed not as friend or foe, but simply as patient. The days that followed opened the nurse's eyes to something even more shattering, the sheer scale of American medicine. What had at first seemed like a palace soon revealed itself to be a machine of healing, vast and relentless, a reflection of industrial might turned towards saving lives. In the German field stations, survival had often been a matter of luck. A soldier shot in the chest had little chance. A wound to the abdomen was almost always fatal, but here in Fort Sam Houston's General Hospital, the rules seemed rewritten. Entire wings were dedicated to surgery. Endless rows of cabinets held glass vials, bandages, morphine ampules stacked as if supply were infinite. It was not only the abundance, it was the rhythm, the precision. Each morning, trains arrived carrying fresh shipments of blood plasma. Nurses watched as crates marked U.S. Army Medical Department were unloaded, thousands of units ready for use. By 1943, America had already produced more than 13 million pints of plasma, a figure that dwarfed Germany's meagre attempts. For every wounded soldier entering these wards, there was a chance, a real chance of survival. Penicillin became the symbol of this difference. Still experimental in Europe, reserved for the highest officers or secret research labs, here it was applied with matter-of-fact efficiency. The German nurses saw it injected into a young soldier whose leg was blackened with infection. Within days he sat upright, colour returning to his cheeks. Anna Keller wrote in her hidden diary, "They treat infection as if it were a cough. What is a miracle to us is routine to them." Numbers echoed like thunder in their minds. In 1 month, this hospital alone could process over 6,000 patients. Surgeons worked in shifts, sometimes completing more than a dozen operations each day, and the survival rates, over 70% for abdominal wounds, were staggering compared to the 20% they had known in the East. The contrast was not propaganda. It was measured in bodies that lived instead of died. Even the gossip among the staff carried numbers that stunned the Germans. One American orderly mentioned casually over coffee that in Detroit, a factory produced X-ray machines faster than the army could deploy them. Another boasted that every soldier, private or general, had equal access to penicillin. For women raised in a system where hierarchy determined who lived and who was left behind, these claims sounded almost heretical. Hilde Braun confessed to another nurse late one night, "If these figures are true, then Germany cannot win, not because of weapons, but because of this." She gestured toward the ward, where the soft rhythm of breathing machines filled the air. It was not tanks or aircraft that had shaken her belief. It was rows of men surviving wounds that back home would have been death sentences. The realization settled slowly but heavily. America was not just fighting with guns, it was fighting with science, and science was winning. One morning, the German nurses were escorted into an operating theatre. The scene inside was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Rows of gleaming instruments lay under bright lamps, their metal surfaces shining like mirrors. Surgical team moved with the rhythm of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Masks pulled tight, gloved hands steady, voices calm. But what stunned them most was not the precision of the doctors, it was the soldiers. Men they had seen days earlier in crisp uniforms carrying rifles on the battlefield were now standing at operating tables, transformed into healers. Corporals and sergeants bent over patients, carefully adjusting IV bottles, holding limbs steady as doctors sutured wounds, wiping the sweat from a fevered brow. These men, trained for war, now served as attendants of life. Hilde Braun's eyes lingered on one particular soldier, a young sergeant who moved awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence as he changed a bandage. She whispered to Anna Keller, "His hands are made for rifles. Not for this." Yet, as they watched him gently lift the head of a wounded man to offer water, both women felt a stirring they could not explain. The contradiction tore at their hearts. Later, during their evening rest, the women spoke in hushed tones. One admitted she'd seen an American chum reading a patient's letter aloud, his voice soft, pausing so the man could smile at the words. Another described a medic who sang quietly while disinfecting a wound, as if reminding the soldier he was not alone. Small moments, insignificant to those who gave them, but unforgettable to those who witnessed. This duality unsettled the German nurses. In Germany, soldiers and medics occupied different worlds. Men were warriors, women were healers, the two rarely mixed. Yet here, war blurred into care, discipline into compassion. The hospital was proof that the same hands capable of destruction could also be trained to mend, to comfort, to save. Anna Keller could not rid herself of an image from that day, a soldier's bloodied hand gripping the wrist of the very American medic tending to him. In that grip she saw neither enemy nor friend, only human frailty and trust. Later in her diary she wrote, "If soldiers can become nurses, then perhaps war itself is not the only destiny." The gossip travelled fast. One American captain had even earned a reputation among the German prisoners for personally cleaning bedpans when orderlies were too busy. Such stories spread disbelief among the captured women. Could officers in America truly lower themselves to such tasks? It seemed like a reversal of every law they had known. By the time the lights dimmed in the wards, the German nurses found themselves staring into silence, haunted not by the wounds of war but by the revelation that their enemies could heal with the same devotion as they fought. Night fell over the camp, and with it came the silence that invited memory. For the German nurses, memory was a cruel companion. The more they saw of America's hospitals, the more bitterly the contrast stabbed into their pride. Anna Keller could not erase the image of the small medical station outside Stalingrad where she had worked, only months earlier. The roof leaked, the air reeked of decay, and men lay groaning on straw mats. Supplies were so scarce that morphine was reserved only for officers. She recalled how one young private, barely 18, had begged for something to ease his pain. The doctor had shaken his head, whispering, "There is nothing left." Hours later, the boy died. That memory returned with venom as Anna walked past an American storeroom where morphine bottles were stacked in orderly rows, enough to last months. Hilda Braun remembered her own moments of desperation. She had once boiled snow in a rusty tin kettle, using it to clean a wound because no disinfectant was left. Now she watched American medics sterilize dozens of instruments at once in gleaming autoclaves. It was as if she had stepped from medieval darkness into a future her homeland had been denied. The disparities were more than medical, they were spiritual. Germany had taught them to take pride in sacrifice, to endure shortages with stoicism. Yet what was sacrifice worth when faced with a nation that seemed to overflow with abundance? The nurses exchanged glances heavy with shame. One muttered bitterly, "We were proud of our hardships. Now I see they were chains." The silence of the ward at night became a mirror of their doubts. A wounded German soldier whispered to Anna, "Why do they feed us so well? Why not let us starve?" She had no answer. Pride once kept her spine straight. Now the weight of the truth bent her shoulders. Their conversations grew hushed, uneasy. One night a guard overheard Anna speaking to Hilda. If America can save lives in such numbers, perhaps the future belongs to them, not to us. Hilda did not reply, but the silence between them was sharper than any words. For the first time, ideology cracked, not under the hammer of propaganda, but under the pressure of lived reality. The German nurses had been taught that America was decadent, chaotic, incapable of discipline. Yet every corridor, every operating table, every full storeroom testified to a truth they could not deny. And so the question rose, whispered like a ghost among them. A question I must now turn to you, the audience. If you had stood in their place, watching your enemy heal with more kindness and abundance than your homeland could provide, what would you have felt? Shame, relief, or perhaps something even harder to admit? The longer the nurses stayed within the hospital walls, the more their sense of reality unravelled. What shocked them now was not only the scale of America's resources, but the way society itself seemed woven differently inside these wards. One afternoon, they entered a surgical unit where a tall black medic named Sergeant William Carter directed the movement of orderlies. His voice was calm, his instructions clear, and white officers followed his lead without hesitation. To the German nurses, raised in a society where race was twisted into a hierarchy, the sight was unthinkable. Hilda Bronn clutched Anna Keller's sleeve and whispered, "Do you see?" They obey him. The words carried both disbelief and awe. Then came another revelation. In the same ward, a female surgeon, Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, worked side by side with her male colleagues. She did not defer. She did not step aside. She commanded respect with her skill. When she completed a delicate procedure on a shattered leg, even senior male doctors nodded in admiration. To the German women, who had been told their highest calling was obedience and sacrifice, this was an earthquake. The gossip among the nurses reflected their confusion. One swore she had seen a young black nurse teaching a white soldier how to change a bandage. Another insisted she overheard a female doctor giving orders to an entire room without a single man challenging her. Each story chipped away at the rigid categories they had once believed immovable. At mealtimes, the contrast grew sharper still. Trays arrived with apples, bread, fresh milk, and steaming coffee. The nurses could hardly eat for the shock. Only months earlier, back in Germany, their rations had been watery turnips and stale crusts, and even doctors' families sometimes went hungry. Here, even prisoners received what felt like feasts. Anna wrote in her diary, "I cannot decide what wounds me more, their kindness or their abundance." And so the questions deepened. If America could afford to feed enemies well, what power did it hold behind its factories and fields? If women and men, black and white, could share authority here, what did that say about a society they had been told was decadent? The silence after lights out grew heavy with these doubts. Some of the nurses clung to their pride, insisting it was all a facade meant to break their spirit. Others felt the cracks widening inside, admitting quietly that they had glimpsed a world their own nation could never give them. Now, dear listener, I turn to you. Do you believe abundance and equality change hearts faster than speeches or victories on the battlefield? Can the sight of food, fairness, and healing undo years of ideology more effectively than any weapon? Share your thoughts, because this is not only their story, but a question that echoes through history to this very moment. By late autumn of 1943, the German nurses had grown accustomed to the rhythm of American hospitals, but not to the constant reminders of what their homeland lacked. Each new day revealed another layer of abundance, another fracture in their pride. They watched as rows of X-ray machines were wheeled into wards, each one able to reveal shrapnel fragments in seconds. They saw crates stamped "Penicillin US Army," stacked so high it seemed as though infection itself had been defeated. They heard typewriters clicking late into the night as administrators catalogued every patient, ensuring no name was lost to neglect. For women who had once rationed paper to record the dead, this devotion to the living was disorienting. The gossip that reached them now was no longer about small acts of kindness, but about scale. One orderly bragged that American factories were producing penicillin by the ton, enough to supply every theatre of war. Another claimed that the US War Department had built more than 200 general hospitals by that year alone, each larger than anything Germany could sustain. Such figures were not propaganda. They were visible in the endless lines of clean sheets, the shelves heavy with medicine, the never-ceasing trains that arrived with fresh supplies. And then there were the letters. Some of the nurses, given pencils and paper, began drafting secret notes to family back in Germany. They described not barbed wire or punishment, but astonishing visions. Sterilizers that ran all day without breaking, wards where enemy soldiers lay side by side recovering. They wrote of a black medic saluted by white officers, of female surgeons commanding respect. These were not tales of victory in battle, but of a future glimpsed through the walls of an American hospital. Anna Keller's diary grew heavier with each entry. One night she recorded, "I believed once that our nation would shape the world. Now I see another future, one of machines, medicine, and mercy. Perhaps the war is already decided, not in the trenches, but in these corridors." The transformation was subtle yet irreversible. They had entered as prisoners, wrapped in loyalty to a cause. They now stood as witnesses, bearing testimony to America's strange power to heal, to feed, to welcome even enemies into its circle of care. The image that lingered with them most was symbolic. A German soldier, pale and weak, reached out for a glass of milk placed at his bedside. An American nurse steadied his hand. In that moment, the war outside seemed far away. What remained was a single truth: survival made possible not by ideology, but by abundance and humanity. And as the nurses closed their eyes that night, they carried with them a memory that would not fade, that America's strength lay not only in weapons, but in its ability to heal, and that this too was a form of victory. As the years passed and the war's echoes grew faint, the memory of those hospital corridors lingered in the minds of the women who had once walked them in shock. The light, the antiseptic smell, the quiet discipline of healing hands, these became images far more enduring than the thunder of artillery or the march of boots. What they had seen was not just a hospital, but a mirror held up to the future. For Anna Keller and Hilda Braun, the war ended in captivity, but their inner journey was more profound than their capture. In Germany, they had known scarcity as a form of pride, suffering as a test of loyalty. In America, they witnessed abundance treated as commonplace, equality practiced in hallways where men and women, black and white, worked without pause to save lives. It was not lectures or leaflets that broke their certainty. It was the sight of a glass of milk offered to a prisoner, the sound of an oxygen tank hissing through the night, the knowledge that infection no longer meant death. One former POW nurse interviewed years later admitted that she dreamed not of battlefields, but of the steady rhythm of rivet guns building hospital equipment, of the endless trains delivering supplies. The machinery of war in America had been turned as powerfully toward life as toward destruction. That memory haunted her more than defeat, and so we are left with a truth that transcends nations and centuries. Victory is not only written in flags planted or cities occupied. Sometimes it is written in the quiet survival of the wounded, in the dignity granted to an enemy, in the legacy of science and compassion that shapes generations yet unborn. The sheer scale of the American medical effort continued to astound the German nurses. They witnessed procedures and technologies far beyond anything they'd encountered in their own military hospitals. The precision and efficiency were breathtaking. A constant stream of wounded soldiers arrived, processed, treated, and often discharged, all with an almost terrifying calm. The nurses started to notice patterns, connections between the seemingly disparate elements of this vast medical machine. The speed and efficiency of the hospital weren't just about individual acts of kindness, or even the advanced technology. It stemmed from a deep societal commitment to systematic care, a level of organization and resourcefulness unimaginable in war-torn Germany. The sheer volume of supplies, bandages, medicines, blood plasma, was astonishing. It wasn't just a matter of having enough. It was the relentless, organized flow of resources that kept the system running smoothly, day after day, week after week. This implied a level of industrial capacity and national planning that dwarfed anything in their own country. One evening, Anna and Hilda were talking in hushed tones. Anna spoke of a conversation she had overheard between two American doctors discussing the logistical challenges of transporting blood plasma across the country, ensuring its freshness and availability. The sheer scale of the operation, the level of coordination and communication required, filled Anna with a sense of awe, but also unease. Hilda recalled a conversation with an orderly, a young man who had described how the hospital was constantly evolving, adapting to new challenges, constantly improving its techniques and procedures based on data and experience. The idea of such systematic, data-driven improvement was foreign to their own haphazard approach to medical care back in Germany. The American system, they both realized, wasn't just about healing individuals, it was about constantly optimizing the entire process of healing, using technology, organization, and a staggering level of resources to achieve its aims. This wasn't just medicine, it was an industrial-scale operation of compassion. It was the systemic difference that was striking and slowly chipping away at their preconceived notions. The nurses' private conversations now revolved around the deeper implications of what they were witnessing. The relentless efficiency, the abundance of resources, the seemingly seamless integration of diverse individuals within the hospital system. These were not isolated occurrences. They were reflections of a vastly different societal structure. This system was not simply more efficient, it was fundamentally different. It operated based on principles of equality and systematic care, which contradicted everything they had been taught about the American character. Their carefully constructed beliefs about America, of its supposed chaos, its individualism, its lack of compassion, were gradually being eroded by the stark reality of the hospital's daily operation. They were seeing a society that prioritized cooperation and systematic care over individual ambition, a society where resources were distributed equitably, where race and gender did not limit opportunity. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing, it was a living embodiment of American values, values they were forced to confront and reassess. The more they observed, the more profound their internal conflict grew. Their initial shock was slowly giving way to a deeper, more unsettling realization. The contrast wasn't simply one of resources, but of ideology. America's approach to medicine wasn't merely technologically superior. It was underpinned by a fundamental belief in the inherent worth of every individual, a commitment to healing that transcended national boundaries and wartime animosity. The quiet efficiency of the hospital continued to shape their perspective. They noted the meticulous attention to detail, the unwavering focus on patient care, the dedication of staff to their work, irrespective of race or gender. All these factors spoke to a very different societal fabric, one where merit and ability superseded social hierarchies, where systematic efficiency reigned supreme. The nurses began to understand that America's power lay not only in its advanced technology and vast resources, but also in its capacity for organization, planning, and commitment to a common goal, a level of societal cohesion that had been fractured by their own nation's ideology and war-torn circumstances. This realization would continue to shape their thinking long after they left the hospital, influencing their perceptions of America and its role in the world far beyond the confines of Fort Sam Houston. The approaching end of 1943 brought with it a growing unease amongst the German nurses. Their time at Fort Sam Houston was drawing to a close. Repatriation was on the horizon. The looming return to their homeland stirred a complex mix of emotions: relief at escaping captivity, a sense of loss at leaving behind the unexpected sanctuary of the American hospital, and a profound uncertainty about their future. The contrast between the American and German systems of healthcare remained a stark and unsettling presence in their thoughts. The sheer scale of American medical capacity, the vast network of hospitals, the abundance of supplies, the advanced technology, and the seamless organization stood in stark opposition to the desperate shortages, the improvisation, and the often cruel realities they had endured in Germany. This wasn't just a matter of technological superiority. It reflected a fundamental difference in societal values and priorities. The American system, they now realized, was built on the principle that every human life held inherent value, that medical care was not a privilege but a right, accessible to all regardless of rank, race, or nationality. This realization was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their experience. The American approach to medical care had challenged their most deeply held beliefs. The nurses, who had experienced firsthand the brutal realities of war, where resources were scarce and human lives were often expendable, were now confronted with a system that prioritized healing, even for the enemy. This was a profound contradiction to the ideological framework that had shaped their worldview. The small acts of kindness, a shared piece of chewing gum, a friendly gesture, a helping hand, had been memorable, but the systemic efficiency and abundance were even more impactful. The nurses had witnessed a machine of healing, vast and relentless in its capacity to alleviate suffering. This wasn't just a matter of individual acts of compassion, it was a societal commitment to systematic care. The American hospital was not just a place of healing, it was a microcosm of a society that had prioritized human welfare in a way they'd never witnessed or believed possible. The systematic equality, the racial integration, the commitment to efficiency, these aspects of American life were not simply observed but experienced at a visceral level, and those experiences created a dissonant echo against the rigid social hierarchies of their homeland. As their departure neared, the nurses engaged in deeper conversations, privately sharing their reflections on what they had seen. Anna Keller's diary entries during this period reveal a profound shift in her perspective. She wrote of the stark contrast between the overflowing storerooms of Fort Sam Houston and the near-empty medical supply cabinets she'd known in Germany. She contrasted the efficient flow of patients through the American hospital with the chaos and desperation that often characterized German military hospitals. She wrote about the countless seemingly minor but deeply meaningful acts of kindness she'd witnessed, actions that demonstrated a humane approach to the care of the wounded, even the enemy. Hilda Bronn also reflected on the differences, focusing on the societal implications of what they'd witnessed. She acknowledged the profound impact of seeing a diverse staff, black and white, male and female, working together seamlessly to provide care. The integration wasn't merely symbolic, it was a functioning reality, a fundamental aspect of the American hospital's operation. The impending return to Germany intensified their uncertainty. They knew they would carry the memories of Fort Sam Houston, the light, the cleanliness, the efficiency, and most profoundly the compassion within them. These were images that would forever be juxtaposed with their experiences back home, a constant reminder of the stark contrasts between the two systems. The nurses understood that the experience had irrevocably altered their perspectives. They had entered as prisoners of war, but they were leaving as witnesses to a different way of life, a different way of caring for human life. The implications of what they'd seen were far-reaching, affecting not just their views on medical care, but their understanding of society, politics, and their own national identity. The lingering question for them, and for us, is the enduring power of compassion and efficiency. The German nurses bore witness to a system that could seamlessly mobilize resources and human talent to heal, not only its own people, but even those it fought against. This systematic capacity to heal, this ability to mobilize abundance and compassion on an industrial scale, was a form of power, a power that extended far beyond weapons and armies. Their story serves as a reminder that victory is not always defined by battles won or territories conquered. Sometimes it is found in the quiet acts of healing, in the seamless efficiency of a compassionate system, in the ability to transcend the boundaries of nationality